be here. It's always nice to be back in Florida. I'm all over the country the rest of the time. I taught 265 times in 22 states last year alone, and it keeps me on the road a lot. So around the holidays, I get to stay around here a little bit more. But I am very, very excited to be in this area. I get to teach here a couple times a year along, this sort of corridor. You know what I'm talking about, right? And so I hold the honor of actually being able to teach things that haven't been taught correctly. Teach things that haven't been taught at all. I have on my website, which is my name, KrisAnneHall.com, I have an article called Stolen Education, Stolen Children, Stolen Future. It outlines the Marxist takeover of our education system. How many of you like Common Core? Well, guess what? The Marxists started taking over our education system back in 1885. So unless you're in this room and you've been born before 1885, the education that you received is tainted. And so much more so in the realm of history. Because history is not just a tool that we use to bore our children to death and torture them in the school systems. History actually has a purpose. Patrick Henry said, "I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that's the lamp of experience. I know no way to judge the future but by the past." You see, history always repeats. Ever heard of a guy named Solomon? Said there's nothing new under the sun. Human nature never changes. But those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. Because it always repeats. The question is, do you want to repeat the good stuff or the bad stuff? And when we rewrite history, we teach it inappropriately with an agenda. The agenda is always to cause society to repeat the mistakes that make government more powerful. And before you leave here this evening, you'll be convinced that I'm telling you the truth. Because it's not something that I have to fabricate. It's not something I even have to exaggerate or invent. It is the truth, it is history, and when you know it, you can't deny it. Justice Ginsburg sat before Egypt and the world and told them that they should not be using our Constitution as a model as they go to create their new government, because after all, it's so old and outdated that it can no longer be relevant to today's society. I sort of chuckled because I thought, how can Justice Ginsburg, of all people, be discounting things for it being old? And outdated, right. But the truth of the matter is, Ginsburg didn't even have that right. The Constitution is not 200 years old. Actually, for us, it's 1,000 years old. There is nothing in the Constitution that's new or novel. Our framers didn't invent one single principle in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. As a matter of fact, when you know the history of our Constitution, you understand that Thomas Jefferson didn't write the Declaration of Independence, he plagiarized it. Our framers sat down with 700 years of history when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. 700 years of time-tested, blood-bought principles in our Constitution. Not a bunch of good guesses. Not a bunch of random ideas. Not a nondescript experiment. But they took what they knew to be true throughout history, and they created who we are, or who we're supposed to be. Because we're not anywhere near what we're supposed to be. We created a constitutional republic, but we operate more like a kingdom and a democracy every day. Why? Because we've buried that lamp of experience. You cannot know who you are unless you know where you came from. You can't know what we have until you know how we got it. And if you don't know what we have, how do you know what you're supposed to do to preserve it? Do you know why we run to the Supreme Court all the time to tell us what the Constitution means? Because we don't know. But the truth of the matter is, the men who wrote it wrote reams and reams and reams about why they were doing exactly what they were doing so that we wouldn't need anybody's interpretation. And so our framers, learning from 700 years of experience, decided that, guess what? If we keep doing the same thing that we've been doing for the last 700 years, we're going to see the same things over and over again. Hamilton said, experience is the oracle of truth, and where its responses are unequivocal, they ought to be held to be sacred and conclusive. So it happens the same way over and over again for 700 years, and you're doing it the same way today, you're going to get the same results. That's what Hamilton's saying. Einstein said it a little bit differently. If you do the same thing over and over again and expect different results, that's the definition of insanity. So you know what the amazing thing is? The very genius of what our framers did was not declaring independence from Great Britain, but declaring independence from kings. See, they had known nothing but kings, right? For 700 years, they had known nothing but kings. And after 700 years of doing the same thing over and over again and having to fight against kings for more and more liberty and more power restrained from the government, they said, hey, this negotiating with kings thing doesn't work out well. Because kings are always willing to negotiate when you hold a sword at their throat. But once you take the sword away and the people get pacified, then they're back at their same old business. Sort of like election time, right? The politicians tell you exactly what you want to hear around election time because the political sword is at their throat. And then we vote them back in, fall asleep at the wheel, and they go back to business as usual. Isn't it interesting how we have absolutely nothing good to say about government for 3 solid years, and then we end up electing the same people back in there?
Makes no sense.
It's just human nature. Thomas Jefferson said that people must understand that we have the power to change this. And they must also then become so uncomfortable in their present situation that they're willing to suffer the discomfort of changing it rather than to suffer the evils of just living in status quo. He said evils are sufferable. But we've got to get to the point where changing the evil is more comfortable than living in it. And unfortunately, Thomas Jefferson called that a long train of abuses. So what I'm trying to do is show you that the train doesn't have to be as long as it might be. Because there are options, there is hope, and the power rests in the people. Are you sick and tired of an unconstitutional government?
Yes.
Then we have to stop being an unconstitutionally minded people. We are not a reflection of our government. The government is a reflection of the people. Remember, Jefferson tells us governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Government operates the way it does because we consent. So maybe you didn't elect the guy that's in office, but you still consent. Because you still fund everything that they do without question. That's our consent. But we have to understand that we have a power that reaches beyond that. Because Jefferson not only said that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed, he also says that when any government operates contrary to those means, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish establishing new governments then that will be dedicated to the consent of the people. But the genius of our framers was that they did not create and perpetrate and promulgate a kingdom. Because in a kingdom, when you don't like your king, do you start a recall petition? Do you find a new king to run against him in the next kingly election? No. When you are in a kingdom, what's your real only option of getting rid of your king? Right, rebellion and chopping off his heads. See, we don't need to do that. Why? Because we're not a kingdom. We're a constitutional republic. We sort of fantasize about those things, right? But that's not what we want to do, because I'm looking at a young man here who will be the recipient of our negligent actions. Rebellions are never over in a generation. And because we have become so pacified that we don't want to take into our possession the very tools that we have being a constitutional republic rather than a kingdom, and we want to just, even laughingly say, let's just go chop off heads, what we're actually doing is saying we would rather be more comfortable in our servitude than do what's necessary so he can be free. Thomas Paine said, if there be trouble, let it be in my day, so that my child may have peace. But we're all about passing the buck. Let's hurry up and get this budget passed so we can spend him into greater debt. We have to pass a budget, because then the government might shut down. I'm sorry, but that would be the best thing that would ever happen to us. A government shutdown. Please explain to me something. When we had that last government shutdown scare, we were all afraid because we were going to have to put non-essential employees on leave. I'm sorry, but you see, we're supposed to have a limited federal government. How do we even have non-essential employees? If we have a limited federal government with non-essential employees, I'm thinking that's the first cut. Everybody that we would classify as non-essential needs to go. But you see, we've got the wrong perspective. To be honest with you, what I'm teaching, it's the conservative crowd that I'm teaching. I pulled up here, I got here real early. I wasn't quite sure how long it was going to take me to get here. I don't like to roll in the last minute. And some of the polling people were still here. And in the parking lot was a car with two bumper stickers. One said, I am woman, watch me vote. And the other one said, I love Obamacare. And I first thought was, please let this person be here to hear me tonight. I had no idea that you guys were doing the polling thing here, so. My first thought was, yes. But to be honest, they come, not in numbers, but and oftentimes I don't even know they're there. So the majority of the people that I teach are people with a more conservative leaning. But even the people with more conservative leanings are confused about limited government. Now I'm just going to give you a legal disclaimer because I'm an attorney. And I like legal disclaimers. Okay? How many of you have heard me speak before? So you can testify that I don't pull any punches, right? I'm a very plain-spoken person. My husband teases that I don't have a diplomatic bone in my body. I have the ability to be diplomatic. I just don't think we have time. I think we just need to start saying things the way they are. So I'm going to tell you something that's going to, and tonight you're going to hear some things that might challenge you. But even in our conservative circles, we're confused about whether we want a limited government or not. See, I want a limited federal government as long as I can have that Medicaid motor scooter. I want a limited federal government as long as my kids and my grandkids can have federally subsidized student loans. I want a limited federal government as long as we make sure we have farm subsidies and Social Security. I want a limited federal government as long as government will define marriage for me. I'm sorry, those are powers that were never delegated to the federal government. And when we in the conservative circles ask federal government to do that for us, we are actually asking for them to expand a power that doesn't belong to them and exert more control over us. Because we don't understand what limited government is, we've forgotten what liberty is. John Adams said, liberty must be supported at all hazards. We have a right to it derived from our Maker. Notice he didn't say health care needed to be supported at all hazards. But he didn't say national security either. He said liberty, because he knew without liberty, you would have none of these things. But he says, we have a right to this liberty derived from our Maker. He was speaking about natural law. How many of you have heard about natural law before? John Locke. How many of you have heard of John Locke? How many of you have read the complete treatise of John Locke? Interesting. It's the same response everywhere. But if I'd asked that question in 1776, the response would have been exactly the same. Only the people would have been chuckling, looking around for the people who had not raised their hands. See, we think because we're technologically advanced that we're intellectually superior. Problem is, they were light years ahead of us in understanding philosophies and governments and history and that sort of thing, and we've laid that stuff down. But John Adams was reminding us that liberty is a gift from God. Liberty, he says, is derived from our Maker. Natural law is based on the principle that we are created in the image of God. And because we are created in the image of God, we've inherited certain traits from God. One thing that we've inherited from God is freedom. God is the most free being in the universe. Raise your hand if it's your job to tell God how to run things. We've inherited that freedom. But we don't want to live in a place where people are free. And that's not sarcasm. That's realism. You see, if we live in a place where people are free, that means I'm free to lie, and I'm free to steal, and I'm free to murder. I am free to do whatever I want to do, regardless of how that hurts you. Does that sound like a nice place to live? No, because freedom all by itself is anarchy. John Adams didn't say freedom must be supported at all hazards. He said liberty. Because liberty and freedom are not the same thing. Liberty is freedom plus morality. That shared morality that says, I recognize I am free to lie, and I'm free to steal, and I'm free to murder, but I will not because it's wrong. You see, there are only two things that will stop people from doing bad things. Just two. And one of them is not law. How many of you realize laws don't stop crimes? Right? Laws don't stop crimes. I'm going to tell you, I spent over a decade in the criminal justice system. I can tell you that the criminal justice system was not designed to stop crimes. There is no such thing as crime prevention. That's just a brainwashing tool. You see, the criminal justice system was designed to identify criminal activity based on the society, and set up a mechanism to punish criminals. Laws don't stop crimes. Do you recognize that here in this room today, I am free to murder my neighbor anytime I want to? Right? I'm free to do that. I will suffer the consequences for murdering my neighbor, will I not? But I'm free to do it. There are only two things that will stop me. I am free to murder my neighbor anytime I want to, but I will not because it's wrong. Morality. I am free to murder my neighbor anytime I want to, but I will not because I know he's well armed. Force. Morality and force are the only two things that stop people from doing bad things. But the interesting thing is, the more immoral we become as a society, the less able, the less willing, perhaps, we are to govern ourselves. So what we end up doing is crying out to government to keep us safe from ourselves. Now, government throughout history is always waiting for that moment, because government knows it can't make you moral. Any law that tries to make you moral is an effort in futility and always ends up being a tool for tyranny. Because you see, government can't make you moral, it can only apply force. And so when we become so immoral we can't govern ourselves, government's like, oh, please let us help you. Because in order to do that, they have to apply force. And in order to apply force on us, then we have to give them the power to apply that force. And we end up handing more and more and more power to government. And the more power government has, the less liberty we have. Liberty is the enemy of government. Because liberty means we're a moral people who can govern themselves and don't need government. And so, what we have to understand here is that there are some fundamental foundations we've got to restore. We got to turn over the history that we've been lied about. I mean, very basic, simple things like the Constitution prohibited women from voting. When did women get the right to vote in America? Somebody will say 1919, 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. That's a lie. There's nothing in the Constitution that ever prohibited women from voting. And as a matter of fact, women voted until 1807 because it was not based on gender. It was based on property ownership. And as a matter of fact, throw the progressives in a real tizzy, point out that not only did women vote, but so did people of color. Black men voted when they owned property. And it wasn't until 1807 when the corruption hit the state level and they started monkeying with who could vote and who couldn't vote so they could make sure all their friends got to the ballot box with ease and all their enemies couldn't go at all. That might not sound familiar to us, right? But why do we teach that if it's a lie? Well, because we have to teach things that undermine the authority of the Constitution, right? If you raise up generations of people believing that the Constitution is a document of oppression, then it's real easy to teach them that it's a fundamentally flawed document that needs our advanced intellect based on our technological superiority to fix. I mean, after all, we're so smart now, we got to go back and tell the framers what they meant when they wrote the Constitution because they were too stupid to know for themselves. But you see, they didn't even write it. 700 years it took to write that. We're actually celebrating 1,000 years of limited government this year. We should have had the anniversary in February, but we don't teach this history, so don't feel bad we didn't actually celebrate. 1,000 years ago, the Anglo-Saxons were governing themselves. Now, they had been ruled over by a Danish king. The king died, and they resisted the Danes' rule over them again. And they had formed small communities and were self-governing. Problem was, the Danes still wanted their land. And so they kept getting attacked by the Danish people through the Danish kings, and they were having a hard time defending themselves, being small communities that were separated. They couldn't communicate with each other. It's not like they could text each other or send instant chat messages or something. And the Danish king would not negotiate with them. Can you imagine a king negotiating with a commoner? Because at that point, everybody was a commoner. And so what they did is they went to a man named Ethelred. Now, Ethelred's family had been kings over the Anglo-Saxons before, when the Anglo-Saxons had Anglo-Saxon kings. And they went to Ethelred and said, we'll make a deal with you. We'll allow you to be our king on one condition. Your only job is foreign affairs. Your only purpose is to negotiate with foreign kings so that we can live at peace. You will engage in negotiations, treaties, and if we have to go to war, you will help to organize us and pull us together. Well, the condition was, that's your only job. You will leave us alone to govern ourselves. Now, if we've been teaching the Constitution properly all these generations, we would realize that's the very same basis upon which our Constitution stands. The federal government was created with a very limited purpose. One, foreign affairs. And it was supposed to leave the states alone to govern themselves. James Madison said in Federalist Papers 45, the powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined. Those that remain in the states are numerous and indefinite. He said the powers delegated to the federal government through the Constitution are reserved to external objects, meaning foreign affairs. And then he named them. Because remember, I told you, we don't need the Supreme Court. Our framers were very clear. They are war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. And he said every other power, to include the daily affairs and the lives of the people and the prosperity of the state, is reserved to the state and to the people. All the federal government is empowered to do through the Constitution is war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. Is healthcare war, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce?
No.
Is the EPA?
No.
Is the Department of Education?
No.
So here's the bad news. Well, here's the good news. None of those agencies constitutionally exist. Do you know what the bad news is? They exist. Do you know what the good news is? We could stop them now. With no effort. You know what the bad news is? They don't want to. Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution allows our conservative Republican House to end every one of these agencies right now. Without the Senate. You don't need a Senate majority to do this. The power of the purse was put in the hands of the House alone. And if they were really upset about all this executive action and all these agencies, they could have defunded them last week. Last year. But why not? Even Michelle Bachmann, 4 months ago, in frustration, was speaking to someone on Fox, Neil Cavuto it was. I have a radio show, and I took the clip from the Neil Cavuto show and played it because I wanted somebody else to believe me that somebody in Washington, D.C. knows this could end right now. And she says, why aren't we using the power of the purse? It's our most valuable tool. Madison said it was. So the question is, are they ignorant? And that's why they don't use it? I'm sure there are some. Or are they just power hungry and malicious and don't care? So let me ask you something. Can you believe that some of them are ignorant and they just simply don't know?
Yeah.
Okay? So you can also believe that some of them just want power and they're corrupted, right? So let me ask you a question. At the end of the day, what does it matter? Whether they're ignorant or corrupt. Because the results are exactly the same. I confronted a congressman in New York, his name is Chris Gibson, about this Article 1, Section 7. Are you laughing? You know this? Oh my goodness. About this issue, Article 1, Section 7. And he looked at me and said, Miss Hall, you just don't understand how it really works. I said, oh, Mr. Gibson, do tell how it really works. Because I'm actually more interested in how it's supposed to constitutionally work. At which point the dialogue all fell apart and we didn't get anywhere. But the point is, how many of you realized, don't raise your hand because I don't want to embarrass anybody, but can you recognize that the majority of the people in our conservative circles do not understand that we don't have to live like this? We don't have to. All it takes is our majority right now to end this, right now. Why? Because we don't teach the proper history. We don't teach why we have the document. Ethelred makes this agreement and the Anglo-Saxons have a king. The interesting thing is, you start calling somebody a king, don't be surprised when he starts acting like one, right? And kings want power. Kings believe they're born and not appointed or elected, which means the only one they have to answer to is God, and if they're not particularly concerned about what God wants, then what kind of king do you get?
Pagan.
Right, I mean, whatever, you get a king. Well, the other interesting thing about human nature is this. You start looking to government to be your provider, don't be surprised when people start acting like subjects. So all we have to do is go forward 30 years, and we've got a king named Edward the Confessor, and we're already describing him as a generous king. Now, Edward's about to die, and the Anglo-Saxons like him because he's a generous king, but he has no son. So they have to find the cousin who's next in line for the throne. And the cousin that's next in line for the throne is a guy named William I. Now, William I knows he's going to be king. Now, think about it. Don't we have a common saying, it's great to be king? It's great to be king, right? Because you get whatever you want. So think about this from a personal level. If you know you are next in line to be king, aren't you waiting for someone to die? Right? So this is no mystery to William, and he's contacting the Anglo-Saxons saying, look, Edward's going to die. We know this. We know I'm next. This is how my coronation will go. This is how the transfer of power will go. Problem. The Anglo-Saxons don't want William to be king. Because William is not Anglo-Saxon. William's from Normandy. And they've already had their fill of Norman kings. Because Norman kings love taxes, and Norman kings like to rule, and Norman kings are unlimited in their power. And they established what we would classify today as a limited monarchy. A monarchy that is limited by the common law of the people. So they devise a plan to appoint a guy named Harold to be king. He's Edward's right-hand man. He's an Anglo-Saxon. He's going to run the kingdom the way they want him to. But William's not going to stand by and let this happen. Because William's got a nickname. He's called William the Conqueror. What do you suppose happens when you make a guy mad whose nickname is the Conqueror? He conquers. Raises his Norman army, goes over and defeats Harold and the English people in a very famous battle called the Battle of Hastings of 1066. Now William's about to get his own shock, because he's used to being a Norman king. He's used to Norman kings. And he gets there and finds out that he is not an unlimited king, but a king limited by the common law of the people. Now, as king, he has the power to issue a decree that's binding on the people. So theoretically, couldn't he just issue a decree that says, all right, I'm king now, and we're going to run like Normans run, and we're not going to have any more common law? Couldn't he do that? Sure he could. But he recognizes that he's just conquered these people to become king, which means he already has people that don't like him. And if he steps up and automatically removes their common law simply by a decree, he's guaranteed a rebellion, isn't he? And he's going to lose his head. So instead, he thinks, it's probably not a good way to go about that, so what we're going to do instead is fundamentally transform the kingdom so that the people are tricked out of their common law. Common law is the enemy to William, so that's what we have to get rid of. So one of the first things William does is he starts replacing the judges in the common law system with judges who are not loyal to the common law, but loyal to the ideology of the king. So then he can use those judges to enforce his foreign Norman law on the people, even when it's contrary to their common law. He uses that law then to chase the landowners off of their land through threat and force, literally chasing some of them completely out of the kingdom and then conveniently declaring their land abandoned. He then takes possession of their land and hands it over to his foreign Norman friends. Why would you want that? Well, what better way to keep foreign law in a kingdom, to have the kingdom full of people who are foreign and like that law better than the common law? He starts chasing the leadership and the churches out of their positions. Because the church is very, very powerful in this era. And he's chasing the leaderships out and replacing these leaderships with men who are not loyal to the Word of God, but loyal to the ideology of the king. So he can use the churches to make the people do things even when those things are contrary to the Word of God, like abortion. Now this transformation takes place over 40 years through the reign of William I and his son William II. William II is described as being a wicked, evil king, just like his father, but he's only going to rule for about 13 years. Because one day, William II and his little brother Henry I go hunting together. And William II is killed in a mysterious hunting accident. When a stray arrow from his little brother's hunting party mysteriously accidentally kills him, coincidentally making Henry king, right? Raise your hand if you think this is an accident. Well, guess what? Human nature doesn't change, and they didn't believe it was an accident either. So Henry, wanting to keep his head, because even though they didn't like William, murdering your brother to become king is not a popular way to be king. Because if you'll murder your brother, what good are the people to you, right? So he's got to do some things to stop a rebellion. The first thing that he does is he comes to the people and he says, look, I know this sounds really suspicious. This whole death of my brother thing looks really bad. But I want to put your mind at ease, so we are going to do an investigation.
Sure.
We're going to pull together a grand tribunal and determine whether I'm at fault for the death of my brother or not. How's that going to work out when the government's investigating itself? Sort of like every congressional hearing that we have, right? Henry's not at fault for the death of his brother, but the people don't buy it either. So the next thing Henry does is he makes a promise. You see, they figured out that if you want to keep a rebellion down, you got to appease the majority of the people. The majority of the people are Anglo-Saxon. And so he has to appease the majority of the people by promising to marry an Anglo-Saxon queen. Now, because we aren't living in a kingdom, maybe we missed the connection there. If you're Anglo-Saxon and you live in a kingdom and you have an Anglo-Saxon queen, then you have to believe that the crown is going to be sending good things your way. The queen is going to take care of her people. And Henry and his advisors have figured out that the best way to appease the majority of the people is with the expectation of what they're going to get from the government. They don't actually have to get it. They just have to expect it long enough for Henry to keep his head. But the last thing that Henry does is the most important thing. Now remember, I told you it took 700 years to write our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, and a Bill of Rights. Remember? There are 5 documents that were written over those 700 years to which every single provision in our Constitution and Bill of Rights is pulled, even our Declaration of Independence. 5 documents they called them liberty charters. I call them the genealogy of our Constitution. Because just like if someone went back in time and murdered my great-great-grandfather, I wouldn't be here. Any one of these 5 documents not existing, we wouldn't have a Declaration of Independence, a Constitution, or a Bill of Rights. And if we did, it would look totally different. Henry signs the first document. It's called the 1100 Charter of Liberties. It's Henry's promise that kings won't be evil anymore. Ever again. He makes a list of 14 things that kings can't do, because if they do them, they will be evil and oppressive. We wouldn't know anything about repeating anything on that list, would we? Because we're too smart for that, right? Henry says, if any of my baron or earl shall die, now the barons and the earls are the property owners, if any of my baron or earl shall die, his heirs shall not be forced to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom. Because Henry is just pointing out that when the heirs of an estate have to purchase their estate from the government before they receive it, that's an evil and oppressive government. But isn't that what inheritance tax is? How is it that a king in 1100 who knew nothing about internet, CNN, NBC, or Fox, knew that when you have to purchase your estate from the government before you receive it, that's an evil and oppressive government, and we have all those things and we call it revenue? Well, Henry's not interested in liberty. He's interested in keeping his head. But now the people have a written promise that kings can't be evil and oppressive. And they're going to need that promise in 100 years, because they're about to have the most evil king the Anglo-Saxons will ever know. His name is John. John, another Norman king, is a massive taxation king. If you can't pay your taxes in John's kingdom, which is highly likely, you are thrown into prison. You are mutilated. He's cutting off hands, feet, ears, cutting the tongues out of people who can't afford to pay their taxes. And then he's even executing them. They called him ruthless and vicious. You know John, by the way. You probably don't even realize it. How many of you heard of a guy named Robin Hood? That's the king in the Robin Hood stories. But you know what's interesting? We don't even tell the truth about Robin Hood. Robin Hood's famous because we teach our kids that he robbed from the rich to give to the poor. Only that's a lie. Robin Hood was not robbing from the rich to give to the poor in an effort to redistribute wealth. Robin Hood was taking the money from the king and the crown that had been stolen from the people through oppressive and unlawful taxation and returning it to the people so they could live. Remember, John's going to murder you if you can't pay your taxes. Robin Hood's not trying to put everybody on equal financial footing. He's giving people their lives back. He is not a socialist, he's a liberty fighter. Because the first step to liberty is always a right to life. Well, something else that I wish we would learn in our society today that's been repeated throughout history but exemplified in John's reign. Murdering people for not paying their taxes is not enough to start a rebellion. Because rebellions against governments, your own government, never comes about because of money. You see, if societies are only focused on stuff, prosperity, and balanced budgets and housing numbers, history dictates that tyrants will always be able to trickle down just enough stuff to make us happy subjects. Good news is, tyrants always commit fundamental errors. They get power drunk, thinking they can do anything and the people will do nothing. John's fundamental error is this. The people have chosen a man named Stephen Langton to be their archbishop. John says, I don't like this guy. He's not going to do what I tell him to do. I'm going to pick who the leader of your church is going to be. But John's already forgotten about the 1100 Charter of Liberties, and it was just 100 years ago. Because the very first promise Henry makes in the 1100 Charter of Liberties is that the church will be completely free from government intrusion. He used the word wholly free, which means completely, without spot of any government in your church at all. That's the fundamental foundation for our First Amendment, is it not? So here you go. Those of you who have heard me speak before know this is coming. I hope you're prepared. I'm going to give you a pop quiz. No answering out loud, please. I don't even want you to lip sync. And no cheating. I don't know if you have smartphones or whatever. No pocket constitutions. There are 5 individual liberties in the First Amendment alone. I want you to name all 5. To yourself. We have a Supreme Court justice here in Florida by the name of Fred Lewis. He took a poll and found out that only of the people who he polled, only 2% could name all 5. Now, I don't know where you fall in that statistic. It's none of my business. But I asked you that question so I could ask you this one. See, if you don't know what your rights are, you, individually, do not know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? You don't have constitutional rights. Let's just be clear about that. There are no such thing as constitutional rights. Because the Constitution does not grant, delegate, or give you any rights. Your rights are inherent, inalienable, gifts from God, not from government. You don't have constitutionally protected rights. The Constitution does not protect your rights. It cannot. Can the Constitution pick up a pen and write your representative a letter? Can the Constitution sit in your senator's office and demand compliance? Can the Constitution pick up a sword, if it ever becomes, God forbid, necessary to alter and abolish in the way that Jefferson said might happen? Can that happen? No. Because the only defender of your rights is sitting in your seat. And if you do not know what they are, then I know you're not exercising them. And if you're not exercising your rights, they're already gone. What good is freedom of speech if you never say anything controversial? Freedom of speech doesn't protect popular speech. Popular speech needs no protection. And how long of saying nothing until you can say nothing at all? That's why this is so important. Well, a revolution comes against John, bringing us the second document, the Magna Carta. John is going to sign the Magna Carta because he's got a sword at his throat, and the people are going to remove him from the throne less than a year later. But the Magna Carta is an amazing step, because even though the 1100 Charter of Liberties was a promise from the king that kings wouldn't be evil anymore, the Magna Carta is not a promise from the king. The Magna Carta is a demand from the people. It's 1215. They're still subjects. They have no privileges unless the king says so. But now the people are standing up and saying, hey, you made us a promise 100 years ago that kings wouldn't be evil and oppressive. You obviously have no idea how to keep that promise, so now we, the people, are going to rise in our majesty, put ourselves above the king, and we're going to start telling the kings what they can and cannot do based on that promise. They create a committee called the Royal Council that will sit in the king's court with the authority to tell the king, no, you can't do that because it violates your promise. No taxation without representation. Clauses 38 through 40 are where we get our 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th amendments. Clause 61 in the Magna Carta is very important. Clause 61 is where the people declared that the people have a right to petition the government for a redress of their grievances. That should sound familiar. That's the 5th aspect of the First Amendment. If you got 4, you probably forgot that last one, the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of our grievances, because we don't use those words. So here's the First Amendment in an easy-to-remember form. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, the freedom to assemble, and the freedom to complain. That's what that means. The right of the people to petition the government for a redress of your grievances means you have the right to complain about your government and to your government. And the government cannot persecute you or prosecute you. But how long of not complaining until you can't? Well, telling kings what they can and cannot do is not going to go over well. And the people are going to have to fight kings and queens for the next 400 years. So we're going to fast forward for time's sake to 1625. The king's name is Charles I. Charles I is described as being a massive spending king. I read one account in history that said, Charles loved to romp about Europe spending on his every whim and fancy. We've been paying for vacations for a long time. Whose money is Charles spending? The people's money, right? How is he collecting their money? Taxes. Well, the Royal Council is now called Parliament, and Parliament gets sick and tired of Charles' wasteful spending, stands up to Charles and says, we're not passing any more of your laws until you get your spending under control. The Magna Carta gave them that power. They're literally looking at the king and saying, we are defunding all your activity until you get a budget. Well, Charles doesn't like this idea, so he dissolves Parliament. Now, he didn't have to call in the Sergeant-at-Arms to get rid of him, right? He could have just said, where Parliament refuses to legislate, I'll just go ahead and regulate. Couldn't he have just held a State of the Kingdom address and said, if Parliament will not pass laws, I will? After all, I have a quill and a messenger. Seriously, though, isn't that the same as dissolving Parliament? Yeah. And if they act like it, then they are, right? Well, Charles knows that if you get too tyrannical too fast, they'll hold a sword at your throat. So he wants to keep collecting the money, but he's dissolved Parliament, so we know he can't pass a tax. So he issues a decree to collect the people's money. Oh, don't worry, it's not a tax, he says. It's a forced loan. It's not a tax, it's a mandate. And a rebellion begins, bringing us the third document. The Petition of Right of 1628. Not about taxes, but about denial of representation, about denial of due process, indefinitely detaining people without a trial. Charles signs the Petition of Right of 1628 because he has a sword at his throat. But the people don't remove him from the throne like they did John. They let him stay. How many think Charles is going to change his behavior? He does change something. He realizes that if he's going to take the people's money, he can't whim and fancy it. So he's got to have a good excuse. Good news for Charles, the years between 1628 and 1641 provide him with the perfect excuse, because there are wars all over Europe. So Charles comes to the people and says, hey, you see all those wars our neighbors are fighting? Let me ask you a very, very important question. Do you want those wars to come here, to Great Britain? Of course you don't want those wars to come here. We want them to stay over there. Well, I have the perfect plan to make that happen. And really, it's very, very simple for you. You don't have to do anything, really. All you have to do is give me your tax dollars. And when you give me your tax dollars, I'll make sure all our allies are adequately funded in these foreign wars. And when our allies are adequately funded, they'll be superior in their power and their strength, and they'll win those wars over there. And when they're won over there, they're done over there. They never come to us. It's a matter of national security that you could give me your taxes. But the people are watching Charles very closely. And they're noticing Charles is not funding their allies. He's funding their enemies. Because he's struck a deal with the enemies. The enemies have promised that if Charles helps them win, they'll come over to Great Britain and help Charles get his people back under subjection. Charles is brought upon charges of treason, found guilty and sentenced to death. A process that brings us the fourth document called the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. This is an amazing document. It says, the root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design, subverting the fundamental laws and liberties of our kingdom. So what does that mean in modern English, right? It basically means we've been watching tyrants now for 600 years and we're noticing a pattern. The same things over and over again. A wicked, evil plan whose only purpose is to undermine and overturn liberty. And when you read the Grand Remonstrance, you see the plan. Corruption of the court system, infiltration of foreign law, the government diminishing the property rights of the people, the government taking control of the church, the government creating fiat money so they can manipulate the monetary system, and the government disarming the people while the government remained armed. We wouldn't know anything about that today, would we?
No.
Well, Charles did all that and they chopped off his head. Now before we get too excited, 40 years later we have a brand new king, same old design. Because the kings are learning what you can and cannot do to make sure that the people are subdued while you're taking all their stuff. And James has figured out that you can take whatever you want from the people as long as you give them something to distract them. And James says, pay no attention to what I'm doing here. I'm going to give you something you've never had before. I'm going to issue a decree called the Declaration of Indulgence, and I am going to give you religious liberty. You no longer have to be a member of the Church of England. You can have church anywhere you want, with any pastor you want. You can preach any religion you want, anytime you want. And the government will not persecute you or prosecute you. On one condition. Before you have church, you must inform the king where you're meeting, when you're meeting, who will be preaching, what will be said, and you must promise that you will never say anything bad about the king. Ever. See, that doesn't sound like religious liberty. That sounds like a 501c3. 7 bishops stand up to James and say, you know what? We have a promise over 500 years old that says the church will be wholly free from government intrusion. We're not following your decree. James throws them in prison. Now, James has learned from Charles, you got to give them their day in court or they'll chop off your head. So he makes sure these bishops have their day in court, but he charges them with a crime called seditious libel. And James has nothing to fear. Because even though these bishops are going to get their day in court, seditious libel is written in such a way that truth is no defense. So even if you're correct when you say the bad things about the king, you still have to die. 7 bishops got their trials. 2 of them were acquitted because 2 judges refused to enforce an unconstitutional decree. The other 5 were also acquitted because they had a jury of their peers who refused to find them guilty of an unconstitutional crime. We did not invent the right to a trial by jury of our peers, and we did not invent jury nullification. We inherited them. A revolution is brought against James called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. It's called the Glorious Revolution of 1688 because they say hardly a shot was fired. James got so nervous about losing his head that he got on his horse and ran away. And we get the fifth document, the English Bill of Rights of 1689. The English Bill of Rights of 1689 says, whereas the late King James II, by the assistance of evil judges, counselors, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the laws and liberties of our kingdom. That word extirpate, I looked it up. I didn't know what it meant. It means to completely destroy. And so they're accusing James of completely destroying liberty. That means there's nothing left, right? Completely gone. Now you need to go read that list. It's available online. You can read it. I'm going to share one with you. James is completely destroying liberty by writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law, when that's a power reserved to Parliament alone. Because we didn't invent separation of powers, we inherited it. They had an executive branch in the king, a legislative branch in Parliament, and a judicial branch. Separation of powers says that powers cannot be shared and they cannot be stolen. And they said when the executive branch was writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law, when that's a power reserved to the legislative branch alone, that's the complete destruction of liberty. Again, I have to ask you, these people had no internet, no cell phones, no MSNBC or Fox. How did they know executive orders were the complete destruction of liberty? And our Parliament, Congress, does nothing today. Well, I'm sorry, we have a new plan. We're going to sue the president. How many of you heard about that? John Boehner's big plan, go sue the president, right? How many think that's a good idea? How many of you realize it wasn't John Boehner's idea? It was Trey Gowdy's idea. So, while we're pointing fingers, let's make sure we go in the right direction. Because whether it's ignorance or evil, what does it matter? So here's why suing the president is bad. It's not only bad, it's extremely bad. It's dangerous. So Congress says, we're going to sue the president in federal court. Who appoints federal judges? Brilliant move, right? Woohoo! Not only that, you must recognize that federal courts have not followed the Constitution for decades. They follow precedent. So when we sue the president in federal court, the question will not be, is this president acting constitutionally? The question will be, is this president doing anything much different from previous presidents? And what do you suppose their answer is going to be? And then Congress will have created their own death sentence. Because the court will then put their seal of approval on everything that this executive branch is doing, and they will create from this day forward an unlimited power resting in the executive branch. And then there's only one solution left. One peaceful solution, that is. The states must reassert who they are as the creators of the federal government, as the creators of the Constitution, and the holder of the power. Our states have the power to control the federal government. They are the creators of the federal government. But we have a federal government where the creation has become more powerful than the creator. Mary Shelley wrote a book about that. We have a Frankenstein federal government because our states don't know their place and their duty to protect the liberty of the people. So did I teach you something today?
Yes.
Well, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I teach a 5-hour workshop on Saturdays where I teach this history in greater detail, and then I walk through the Bill of Rights 1 through 10. I'll tell you why we got the First Amendment, why there are 5 in there. 5 on purpose. First on purpose. Show you where the Second Amendment came from. We didn't invent it, and it has nothing to do with hunting, skeet shooting, or gun collecting, and they didn't even think about stand your ground from a robber or a rapist. They were talking about overthrowing tyrants, an oppressive government. Why do we have the Third Amendment? Where did that come from? How about the Fourth Amendment? Well, here's a good question. What are the proper national security exceptions to the Fourth Amendment? Well, we talk about that at the workshop. The Fifth Amendment. How has the Department of Justice destroyed your Fifth Amendment? The Sixth Amendment. How has your Bar Association destroyed the Sixth Amendment? Seventh Amendment. How is the EPA a direct violation of your Seventh and Eighth Amendments? And why, most importantly, are the Ninth and Tenth Amendments the most important clauses in the entire Constitution and Bill of Rights? See, if we can't answer these questions, how can we defend our rights? If you can't define liberty, then you can't defend it. If you can't define tyranny, then you can't defeat it either. So I want to offer to you the opportunity to have me come back and teach my workshop here. I want to let you know that I charge no speaking fees. I've traveled all over the country. I have no speaking fees. I don't make anybody compensate me for travel or accommodations. Some groups take up love offerings. I get donations, and we operate off the revenue from the books. We don't sell books. We're actually revenue from the books because we are a consulting firm, and the book is a consulting tool. See how that works? So I want you to understand that it's not going to cost you anything to have me come back. But what's it going to cost us if we remain ignorant? I also have on the table back there a 3 DVD set of a workshop that I taped live from Orlando. It's a couple years old. How many of you noticed I have no teleprompter? Yeah. Okay? I teach the workshops the same way, which means every single workshop is unique, and the government, frankly, is giving me more and more stuff to teach all the time. So it changes. How many of you realize the history that I just taught you is not being taught in our schools?
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's why we have these children's books. The purple book is geared for middle school, high school level. The blue book is for everybody else younger. These teaches you the history that I just taught you, but also teaches chapters on founders and framers that they never hear about. How many of you know who Crispus Attucks is? Ned Hector, Peter Salem, Penelope Barker, Mercy Otis Warren, Elizabeth King, James Otis Jr., Richard Henry Lee. All these people are essential to understanding who we are. And we ignore them. John Leland. We ignore them for one reason or another. And it's important for our kids to know the truth, because we're dooming them to repeat our mistakes. I also have an adult version of the history, a very limited number of copies of these, because we are, I don't travel with these books too much anymore, but this is the adult version of the history that I just taught you. How many of you would like to know the solutions to fixing these problems? Remember, let me ask you this, have you figured out that history repeats?
Yes.
Are you stunned at how precisely it repeats? I mean, it's stunning to me. I see it all the time, and it still gives me goosebumps. Well, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to figure out what's going on. We just need to be reconnected with history and the plan that our framers gave us. The Red Book, Liberty First, The Path to Restoring America, is how we start a revolution of the mind. How do we get that proper function of government perspective? How do we understand that the only way we are going to have a limited federal government is if we become a self-sufficient people, a self-responsible people? And then the Sovereign Duty book is my new book. It's not even 2 months, I might even not even 90 days old. This, remember when I told you that the states have to assert their proper role? This will teach your state how to do that. Not only your state, but your sheriff, your county commissioner, your city councilman. Do we have any county commissioners today? Any city councilmen? How about the sheriff? Is he here? She? Any state reps? Senators? These are the people that need to read this book. I got bad news for you. Florida in Tallahassee does not understand the power of the people in the states. Our Tallahassee government is completely infiltrated by federal supremacists. Senate President Don Gates, when I tried to teach him this, Senate President Don Gates sent me an email and told me that he thought that I should be shot or hanged. Those are his words, shot or hanged for even asserting that the state has a power over the federal government. We have a lot of training to do. A lot of training to do. And that's why we have this. I didn't come here to teach you, I came here to recruit you. We need some people who are willing to stand. And it doesn't matter how young you are, it doesn't matter how old you are. I was speaking with a gentleman before the meeting. One of the most valuable soldiers that we had in our revolution was 74 years old. They called him the specter of death that came in on the white mare. He was an expert rifleman, and he could stand on a ridgeline and sniper the British soldiers at such a range that they could not fight back. And by the time they got to where they could, he was gone. He had long white hair, and he caused units to retreat just upon his sight. So don't underestimate what you can and cannot do, because we all have a role to play. So we're going to go with a question. I have rules. Hold on. Rule number 1, you must ask a question. Because if you don't get to a question soon, I'm going to interrupt you and say, where is your question? Rule number 2, you must recognize I do not know everything about everything. Good news is I'm not running for office, so I'm not going to try to convince you that I do. Okay? All right, first question. All right, he's going to come over here with the mic. Keep your hand up in the air so he knows where to go. There you go. And I guess they're passing the bucket. Thank you. Right.
Does the supremacy clause negate the 10th Amendment?
Ha! I love that question. That is the most awesome question. Does the supremacy clause negate the 10th Amendment? Why would the founders create such a paradox? That doesn't make any sense to me. And anybody who would assert that the supremacy clause negates the 10th Amendment is asserting that they're illiterate. Because it really only takes a 6th grade reading level to understand that the supremacy clause does not negate the 10th Amendment. The supremacy clause reads, the Constitution and the laws of the Constitution, comma, and the laws of the United States made in pursuance thereof are the supreme law of the land. So, the supremacy clause only allows the laws of the federal government to be supreme if they are compliant with the Constitution. So if it's a law that's not in compliance with the Constitution, it can't be supreme. But think about that. That makes a whole lot of sense, right? Is the Constitution the supreme law of the land? Can we agree with that?
Yes.
Right. Well, if Congress can make a law that's contrary to the supreme law of the land, and that law has supremacy, then is the Constitution the supreme law of the land anymore? What's the supreme law of the land? Congress, right? So that means Congress could pass a law contrary to the Constitution that would give them more power. And if the purpose of the Constitution was to create and define a limited power to government, what good is it if Congress can pass a law to expand their own power? Then they're not limited and defined by the Constitution, are they? Then what's their limitation? Nothing, just their own will, right? Which means that's not a constitutional republic anymore, is it? That's a totalitarian kingdom. So remember, the Supremacy Clause says the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and then any law made by the federal government in pursuance to the Constitution. And remember, the only power delegated to the federal government is war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. So any law Congress makes outside of war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce is unconstitutional. Who's next? Did I scare you? And then
What
the
is the
beautiful lady up here
remedy?
next. Use the
I'm
mic so they
sorry.
can hear.
What is the remedy when someone is voted into office and they put their hand up? I was in the Marine Corps for 8 years, and if I violated my oath, I'd have been in the brig post haste. But when they get up there and swear to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, go right into the House or the Senate, put in a bill to take away our rights, we have no recourse until the next election.
Okay, well, you actually do have recourse. Article 2, Section 4 gives Congress the authority to impeach any civil officer.
But they're all in the same boat. The Republicans
well,
and the Democrats are
here you
playing
go.
games with us.
Right, you understand, but you're operating from the perspective that we are not operating correctly. How many of you, understanding now the truth and how we're supposed to operate, realize that we are so far from operating correctly? Okay, so trying to operate correctly now is not the solution. Because I don't have a magic pill for you. I don't have an incantation to make it all right. We've been going down the wrong road for a very, very long time. Our Supreme Court has been out of whack since 1803. Okay? When they declared themselves the ultimate rulers of the universe. And it's been all downhill after that. But the solution is, number one, in recognizing we're not a kingdom, so we don't have to have revolutions and chop off heads, and understanding that we're a constitutional republic. And frankly, that's why I wrote this book. This is the most important thing I have ever written in my entire life. Not because I have the grand plan to fix all our problems. Number one, it's not my plan. There is nothing in this book that is original or novel or new or invented by me. This book is nothing but a compilation of the plan that our framers put in place for this day. They anticipated a moment in history, in their future, where we would fall asleep and fall prey to tyrannical governments. They anticipated that because they knew human nature. And they told us exactly what to do when that happens. But we've been so good at hiding and brainwashing that we don't even know these solutions lie. Here they are. One of these days I'm going to verify. The last 15 pages of this book is nothing but citations. Every quote, every document in this book that creates this premise is cited to its original source. Not somebody else's book, the original source. So you can test me in what I'm telling you, because I believe this is the solution. But it's not going to be easy. If you're looking for an easy solution, it ain't here. It doesn't happen. There are no easy solutions. But if you're tired of living like this, and if you're tired of realizing that this young man is going to live in servitude because we wanted comfort, if you're tired of that, then it's time to reach for solutions. Up here in the front row, please. The lady in the striped jacket.
You have hit a deep,
No, hold it like this, yes.
you have hit a deep pocket of a daughter that lives up in Wyoming.
Oh,
And her children have been reprimanded for coming to the school with the proper information.
woohoo!
My daughter goes to school and fights for it. How can we get our schools to teach our children what is the proper thing about our Constitution?
Okay. Again, do you want the solution or the easy solution? Because there is no easy solution, okay? The first thing that we have to recognize is we went wrong when we put government in charge of teaching our children in the first place, okay? Because government is not going to teach our children to limit it. Government is going to teach our children that the document is fundamentally flawed and we need to allow them to rewrite it. And that's what Common Core is all about. Common Core will not teach your children any history before 1865.
That's right.
Not only that, when they teach anything about it, your children are going to be taught that our revolution was a result of a bunch of rich white guys who didn't want to pay their taxes.
A load of baloney.
Well, of course they didn't pay their taxes. Why would they pay something that was unconstitutional and tyrannical? Because unfortunately, well, fortunate for them, but unfortunately something that we've missed, our framers understood that the only way the government operates is with our consent, and the only way we can deny our consent is to deny our funding of the government. And they were willing to do what was necessary to keep their children from being enslaved. Thomas Paine said, if there be trouble, let it be in my day, so that my child may have peace. Mercy Otis Warren said, we will stand against tyranny today, or our children will bow tomorrow. They didn't do this for themselves. They suffered the greatest of sufferings so we could be free. Samuel Adams wrote home to John Adams wrote home to Abigail one day in 1776, standing in Boston, frustrated beyond belief, because he's waiting for the reinforcement of troops of the colonists to push back against the regular soldiers. And they're just not showing up. And he writes to Abigail and he says, where is everybody? Are we really going to suffer another loss because people won't show up? He says, how is it that I am going to watch another spring pass by when I am away from my family and nobody will show up? And then he looks forward to us and says, posterity. I hope you know what it cost this present generation to preserve your liberty. And I hope you will make good use of it. For if you do not, I shall repent in heaven that I ever took half the pains to preserve it. How do you think John Adams feels today about what we're doing with the liberty that he preserved? But we're not suffering from it, actually. He will. So the solution is, you need to get your school systems back under control by the communities. Okay? You have more power in Florida than most states do, because it's a constitutional provision that your school boards have ultimate authority over curriculum. Your school board does not have to accept any curriculum from the federal government or even from the state. The problem is you have to teach your school board that it's more economical to be self-sufficient than to rely on federal and state money. You'll actually have a better budget in your school district if you kick the state and federal government money out, because then you won't have the heavy regulations that you have to meet. You know that the federal government has handed down this new food regulation on your schools. There are school districts popping up throughout the country that are refusing to abide, which means the federal government is saying, fine, we won't give you any subsidy for your school lunches. Well, they're figuring out that when they had the subsidy, they were $80,000 in debt trying to keep up with the regulation. Without the subsidy, they were anywhere from $7,000 to $15,000 in profit. So look, the solution to all this problem is to become self-sufficient and to relinquish the dependency that we have on federal government. And the only thing you're going to be able to do then is to take back your children. I think homeschooling is our best option. I believe everybody in this room can homeschool, because there are enough retired people here who could teach their grandchildren. And it's not that hard, really. They have curriculums where all you have to do is sit your child down in front of a television and a video teacher teaches them everything they need to know.
Yeah. Isn't it the government's
No,
video?
no, it's not. There's a curriculum that comes out of Pensacola Christian Academy called ABECA. The ABECA curriculum has ABECA teachers. It streams online, you can get DVDs, and it teaches your children in a curriculum every single day. And you don't have to do anything but facilitate the teaching. But it takes sacrifice. And we're too comfortable. One more question, and then we're done. Wait till he brings you the mic. Thank you.
You talk about foreign policy as the only responsibility of the federal government.
Mhm.
There's 7 responsibilities.
Okay.
Also militia, post office, postal roads, interstate commerce.
No. Okay, but you have to understand. Those were only with the exception of the post office and postal roads, okay, with that exception. All those other powers are to be interpreted in the light of foreign affairs. You said interstate commerce. That's not our association with other states, okay? That's associated with the other states in order to comply with foreign treaties. The Supreme Court has gotten that totally wrong. And all you have to do is read the founders when they tell you. James Madison makes a brilliant argument in this in 1792. Go look up James Madison and the Cod Fishery Bill. See, what had happened was, I don't know if you remember this from your history lesson, but Great Britain did not recognize our independence after the Revolution. Okay? They did not recognize that we were independent from them until the conclusion of the War of 1812. Our framers would call that the Second War for Independence. So between the War of 1812 and our first independence movement, Great Britain did not recognize that we were independent. So what happened was they were coming over here and taking all our codfish off the coast. Decimated our cod fishing industry. So Congress meets and says, you know, we really messed up because we should have anticipated this. And so they said, all right, we need to get together and pass legislation that allows the federal government to protect our coastal waters. Now the key there is they could not protect the coastal waters without first passing legislation, because your federal government has no sovereignty to act. It has no sovereignty to act outside of law. And that law must be passed by the House and the Senate and approved by the President. That's the only way your federal government can do anything lawfully. So they had to pass a law to allow the federal government to protect the coastal waters. And while they're doing this, there were some people who wanted to put pork in the bill. Well, you know, these poor cod fishermen, right? We should have anticipated this, so it's really the government's fault that the industry is faltering and these people don't have an income. So why don't we subsidize the cod fishery industry until the codfish populations grow back up and they can subsidize themselves? James Madison said, are you crazy? You can't do that. That's not something you have the power to do. Well, the government today would say, well, it's commerce. So we have the authority to do that. James Madison said no, and he issued a very stern warning. He said, I believe this is a limited government. He says, I also believe those who ratified the Constitution believe that this is a limited and defined government, but more importantly, the people believe this is a limited and defined federal government. And if you allow the government to expand its power through a term he used called forced construction, meaning we'll allow them to take the Commerce Clause and make it mean anything they want, the General Welfare Clause and mean anything they want, he said you will end up to transmuting the very government that we created. He said these clauses were not there to create a power. They are there to define the purpose of the power delegated. The General Welfare Clause is not a power. The Commerce Clause is not a power. It is a description of the purpose of the power. Why does the government have the power to war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce? For the general welfare of the Union. Meaning they can't engage in a treaty that benefits one state and detriments the other. That's the problem that they were having during the Articles of Confederation. They didn't want that to repeat. What is the purpose of the Commerce Clause? To make sure that the states will abide by constitutionally compliant laws as treaties. So when we engage in a foreign treaty, the states can say, lawfully engage in a foreign treaty that abides by the Constitution. The states can't stand up and say, well, we don't, that's our product. We don't want to play in your treaty. And the Commerce Clause was put there so that the states could not deny the federal government its authorized power. It was not purposed to expand the government's power. And we get out of that course because we allow the Supreme Court to tell us what the power is of the government. How many branches of government do we have? Three. The executive branch, the legislative branch, and? So we can all unanimously agree here today that the judicial branch is part of the federal government, right? So how is it that we allow part of the federal government to define the power of the federal government?
Doesn't make sense.
It makes no sense at all, because then the government is defining its own power. Madison told us in 1799 that if the judiciary can sanction or grant power, then all you're doing is creating a monarchy. And that's why we need to learn this truth. Now, obviously, I can't teach you everything you need to know today. That's why I have a 5-hour seminar. And I would be happy to come back and do that for you.